Larry was one of the first homeless residents of Living Stones that taught me a lot about homelessness and substance abuse. It was probably in the first few years of me being here. There was a little pomegranate bush or something out there, and he used to like to sleep under it. If you look carefully at his hand, you'll see white paint. When an apartment recycles and someone moves out and somebody else moves in, the landlord has to repaint the apartment. Larry used to do that. He was a painter, and they used to pay him cash. And most of what he got, he drank. If the weather was especially bad, he would take some of that and he would stay in a cheap hotel until the weather got better. And then he'd come back here and he'd live under that little bush. And he'd often stop in and we'd have conversations and he'd tell me about things in his life. And one day he comes in with a can of beer. He almost always had some beer with him. And he set it right on that table that was in my office. And he said, "My life is in this can." And I thought, wow, yeah. I have a friend on the internet. I should have put his picture in here. Made this one on AI. His name is Chad the Alcoholic. And Neil Hand, of course, was here for many years, taught me a lot about AA. Neil, of course, was a recovering alcoholic and had been sober for years before he even came to Living Stones. And he had gained sobriety. But the funny thing about Neil was he still was an addictive personality. And he loved to eat. And he loved to take me out to lunch. And then and of course, if you visited his house was filled with records, and he was filled with CDs, and poor Dee had to clean all that stuff out. And when she was cleaning everything out, she found a huge box full of screwdrivers. And she said, he wasn't a handy guy, he didn't do a lot of work, but somewhere along the line, he took a fascination with screwdrivers, and he had a whole box of them that he never used. She just found it. So, see, the thing about freedom is, it's freedom as no longer being restrained by something is a big thing to fill. And so when you're no longer a slave to something, be it drugs or alcohol or some other desire or addiction, you have to fill your life with something else. A number of years ago, when they were studying cocaine, they of course used rats to figure out, well, what exactly does this drug do? They had a group of rats that was in a very rat-friendly environment. There was lots of playthings, there was good community, there was plenty of food, and then they would offer an unlimited amount of cocaine to those rats. And you know what? Those rats tasted that cocaine. I'm sure they got high. But for the most part, those rats didn't become addicted. Then they took a rat and they put a rat in an empty box. No other rats, nothing to play with. Bang! Those rats, they were cocaine addicts before you knew it. And they learned something about addiction. That addiction isn't just about the chemical reactions. That's true. And some people are many people can drink alcohol and think nothing of it. But approximately 9% of the population, and they know this, and this is pretty much around the world, about 9% of the population, and it's not evenly distributed, they drink a little bit of alcohol and bang, it is powerful. And then they've got a fight on their hands. But still, it has everything to do with not just the chemical, but the entirety of their life. Now, last week we talked about God delivering Israel. And God brings them out of Egypt with a powerful hand, the Bible says. And he brings them into the wilderness to worship him. And he seeks to fill a void with his covenant and with his presence that will displace the place of the gods and the place of the leeks and onions and all of the things that, even though they were slaves, they enjoyed in Egypt. Now, it seems to get off to a good start. There's a lot of hiccups at first. There's no water, and so the people grumble and they say, at least in Egypt we had water to drink. Then God provides water. And they're hungry, and they said, at least in Egypt we had food to eat. And so God gives them food. And then they go to Sinai, and God comes on the mountain in great power, and he speaks the 10 commandments to them. And they're terrified, and they say to Moses, "What you go get the stuff and bring it back, and we'll agree." And that's exactly what happens. He goes up in the mountain, gets the law, and they say, everything the Lord says we will do. We're down. We sign on the dotted line. God proposed. We say I do. Here we go. It's going great. And they had, as we talked about last week, all this plunder from Egypt. They had gold and silver and all kinds of things that the Egyptians were so ready to get rid of them. They went and said, here, you can't leave fast enough. Take these things. And so what the Lord does after this little version of the law that you get in 20 through 24 in the book of Exodus is it starts this long section on the tabernacle. The Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to bring me an offering, all that plunder from Egypt. Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Make this tabernacle and all of its furnishings exactly like the plant pattern I will show. Now, often someone will get a little bit interested in Christianity or the Bible and say, Pastor, I want to read the Bible. And so they'll open the book to Genesis and, wow, these amazing stories in Genesis about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, and Judah. And they're like, wow, Genesis was great. And then they're like, Exodus, the sequel. And there's Moses, and they're enslaved in the land, and then there's plagues, and then there's drama about water and food, and then there's the 10 Commandments. Oh, I heard something about them. And then there's all these laws, and so skim, 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 skim. And then they hit the tabernacle, and they're like, oh my goodness, what happened to the story? This was such a good book. And now it's like coverings of this and furnishings of that, and it has to look like this, and it has to look like that. And they're like, what happened to this book? Well, the whole point of this was that Israel is now free, and unless that freedom is filled with something specific and particular, something else is going to happen. And so God says, here, take all of this stuff and put it into the tabernacle, and this will be my house around your houses, and we will all live together. That's the plan. But, remember Carol, not this Carol, the other Carol that was here often. She would tell me about how she had family members that got caught in drugs. And she would tell me about how she would get them off of drugs. And you knew Carol, she's a very formidable person. She would move into their house, and she would get them off of drugs. I mean, she was not about to play around with drugs. And with Carol was there, it was her way or the highway, and she wasn't having anything of it. Because she knew with these addicts, you know what? If you're an addict, boy, they steal a little money. You know, maybe I'm sober for a week or two, but I feel the itching, and I got to go out and get it. Well, when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him. Maybe he fell in a hole. Maybe he fell off the mountain. Maybe that big scary God ate him up, or who knows what happened to him. But we're all sitting here in the desert waiting. I'm itching. You know, back in Egypt, we had gods, and they were big gods, and they were powerful gods. And, you know, yeah, maybe we were enslaved to build these monuments, but those monuments were really cool. Come on, Aaron. Let's get with living. Aaron answered them. Think of the gold earrings that your wives and your sons and your daughters are wearing and bring them to me. It's like, Aaron, You're Moses' brother. You are the mouthpiece through which God spoke, and all of that just sort of goes away. So this offering that they were going to take to build the tabernacle, we got lots of tents. We were in Egypt. I mean, even to this day, people go to Egypt to look at what they built, to look at their God statues and say, wow. So, are we going to spend all this money on a tent? That doesn't seem right. Let's really build something. So they took what they handed to him, and he made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Now, that's important. You're going to remember that he fashioned this with a tool, because a little later this is going to come up again. Then they said, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. Now, first of all, there's like the plural, and it's like, what? What? The gods? I thought it was that God of our ancestors who we had forgotten. And for a lot of modern people, it's like, well, why a golden calf? Well, if you're an ancient, that would have been like the default. There are many, many calf idols around the world. And the reason for that, in fact, if you go to Wall Street today, you know what there is on Wall Street, right? That big bronze bull. Kind of a golden calf right there on Wall Street. Well, why would they put that there? Because for human beings throughout time, especially if you are living in an agricultural place, and you get a little bit of extra grain, and you have a little extra food. You always remember Myron, who used to go to the church. He was vet student at UC Davis. He now takes care of cows down in the Central Valley for Dutch dairymen in Visalia. I remember him talking to me. He said, horses, they're like super delicate. Horses can get sick in tons of ways. You know an animal that, like, you have them, they're like really durable. They don't get sick hardly at all, is a cow. And so, you know, if you're a farmer and you have a bumper crop, you feed it into a calf, because a calf is going to grow, and your cows are going to multiply. Cows are like, for the history of the world, the great investment thing. If you have money and you're an agricultural person, get a cow. It's a lot better than the stock market. They produce very regularly, and they're worth something, and they just eat grass. It's like win-win. And so calves are like fertility and prosperity. Now that's important too, because, well, how do you celebrate fertility? Now, I don't want your minds to go too far lest we run into other preoccupations here this morning, but some addictions follow that as well. But if you remember, what God said from the mountain, what they all said they were due, went like this. And God spoke all these. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image of the form of anything in heaven above or on earth beneath or the waters below. Right from the start, God says, I am here to save you, but unlike every other culture in the world, you cannot reduce me to something here. I am not like a chair. I am not like a table. I am certainly not like an animal. The thing closest to me, the thing made in my image, is actually a human being, but I am way, way more than a human being. So when you try to picture me, do not take anything around you and say, oh, there he is. That's what God looks like. And in fact, part of the reason I never use Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel in my sermons is I think Michelangelo was dead wrong in portraying God as an old man. Because today, many people think, well, that Christian God, he's like an old man. And it's like, no. Read the commandment. God is not an old man. Michelangelo portrayed him that way, and the church decided to put it up. If someone came to me and said, Pastor Paul, I'm going to turn living stones into the new Sistine Chapel, and I'm going to paint this roof with a mural as good as Michelangelo, I would say, we're going to have to talk about the God thing, because no old man. for God. Not going to happen. Even though it was very delightful when one little boy came up to me after the service once, looked up at me and said, "Are you God?" God as old man is a problem. God as calf, definitely not. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there'll be a festival to the Lord." So the next day, the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. We've just been reading. In our men's group, we've read Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. And I really appreciate our men because we walked through how many different kinds of sacrifices. But everybody in the ancient world knew sacrifices. So we got the golden calf. We got the sacrifices. Afterwards, they sat down to eat and drink. And the Bible is so PG here. And got up to indulge in revelry. Now, there certainly was music and singing and dancing. But if you know anything about the ancient world, there's a whole lot more going on. I'll just leave it there. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because," now listen to his language, "your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. And they've bowed down to it and sacrificed to it, and they've said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.' I have seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone, so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you, Moses, into a great nation." It's like, step aside, Moses. The fire on the mountain is about to clean out this camp, and I start all over with you. Now, I think we so often imagine God to be unsophisticated, because what happens right now is so sophisticated. God is presenting something to Moses that is so subtle and so profound. Notice the language. Moses and God have been sort of father and mother in this whole Israel project. And you know how it goes in a family when, like, one of the kids does something that really upsets the one parent and says, "Your son did that." It's like, what do you mean your? We're in this together. What's Moses going to do? Aaron has clearly failed to test his own brother. This is actually an opportunity for Moses. If Moses was really full of himself and really sick and tired of the people, and if you read the story up until this, Moses has good reason to be on God's side about these people. Delivers them from Egypt, and they whine and cry at the Red Sea, and God says, just tell them to be quiet. I'll take care of Egypt. Get out into the wilderness, and they're like, "Where's the water?" Okay, here's the water. "Where's the food?" Here's the food. Moses would have good reason to say, "I can be the new and better Abraham. It cannot be the people of Israel. It can be the people of Moses. I can be lawgiver and patriarch. I can be like a god to them." What will Moses do? The slavery is lifted. And when the slavery is lifted, what do people do? They revert to what they've known. They revert to what's popular around them. They revert to what feels good in the moment. And that which seems to relieve their fears and anxieties. And a spirit jumps the group, and everybody has a good idea. Let's make a calf. Let's have a party. And boy, is it going to be a party. Now, this drama dominates the second half of the book of Exodus. The whole first half of the book of Exodus, it's like plagues and Passover, and then Sinai and 10 Commandments, woohoo! And the rest of the book is like really hard to read. All this tabernacle stuff, and there's this little bit about Sabbath, and then this story, it's right in the middle. And it's structured really specifically to make a point about the people and about God. Because the one thing was, You almost get the sense that for God to walk into Empire Egypt, that the whole world thought was the biggest, baddest nation around, God just strolls in there and says, I see your puny gods. Ping, 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 ping. Out my people go. But now he's got to deal with something inside. Most addicts would far rather steal from their friends and neighbors, betray their children, betray their parents, do anything to feed that. It's way easier to kill a person than to release them from a bondage that is internal. And that's what this story is about. What will Moses do? But Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. Look at the language. It's so specific. The Lord his God. Moses wasn't his own God. His God. Lord, he said, why should your anger burn against, whose people are they now? Your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand. Remember, Lord, when I was the revolutionary and I killed that Egyptian and the Israelites said, what are you going to do us? Kill us like you killed the Egyptian? See? That internal thing. That's really hard. And even God, can kill a man. But to change a man, that's a different level. Why should the Egyptians say, it was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? Everyone in the world is going to say, you're just a killing God. You killed the Egyptians, now you killed these people. That's what your reputation is going to be. You don't want that. Turn from your fierce anger. Relent and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. These are the ones that started this, remember? This was about your promise, to whom you swore, because there's nothing higher to swear upon by your own self. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and will give your descendants all this land I promised to them, and it will be their inheritance forever. And then the Lord said, Moses, you get it, don't you? You understand. You understand what we are about here. Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. Shoo! Oh, no fire from the mountain. But we're not done. You're never done. When Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned. But Moses, he doesn't have the fire like the Lord has. And he threw the tablets out of his hand because they'd broken the covenant already, and they hadn't even gotten the documents to sign, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. And he took the calf the people had made, and he burned it in the fire. It says, you know what this thing says we do with calves? We put them on altars. This calf is something for an altar. I'm going to burn it, and y'all want to eat this calf? Yeah, you're going to eat it. Then he ground it to powder and scattered it on the water and made the Israelites drink it. And he said to Aaron, what did these people do to you that led them into such a great sin? Now notice that Moses is being a mediator. He blunts God's anger, but then he turns and he's bringing the heat now to the people. Do not be angry, my Lord. Aaron, the older brother, says to his younger brother, calls him his Lord. Wow. Most of us didn't notice that because we don't work that way. They sure did. You know how prone these people are to evil, they said. Make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him. So I told them, well, whoever has gold jewelry, take it off. And they gave me the gold, and I threw it in the fire, and whoop! It was a calf. It wasn't my fault. And this is so much that early speech right there at the beginning of the falling of the story. Who told you you were naked? Oh, we ate the fruit. It was the woman that you gave me. Oh, okay. See the pattern? Moses saw that the people were running wild and that Aaron had let them get out of control. and so becoming a laughingstock to their enemies. So he stood at the entrance of the camp and said, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." And all the Levites rallied to him. And he said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Every man strap a sword on his side, go back and forth through the camp from one end to the other, killing his brother and friend and neighbor." Oh my. Oh my. The Levites did as Moses commanded, and that day about 3,000 of the people died. And this isn't about to settle scores with old rivals. We're going to kill our own flesh and blood. What have we done? So Moses went back to the Lord and said, "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold, but now please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book." You remember what God said? "Step aside, Moses, I'm about to blast them." And Moses stood in the way and said, "Don't blast them, Lord." And even now, after Moses had seen everything that had done the big mess, he said, "If you're going to punish anyone, Lord, punish me." But the thing about Moses was he was up on the mountain. He didn't collect the gold. He didn't make the calf. Moses was sinless in this whole incident. Yet Moses stands in the way and says, "Take me, Lord." "Now go." The Lord replied to Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. Now go, lead the people to the place I spoke of, and my angel will go before them. However, when the time comes for me to punish, I will punish them for their sin." And the Lord struck the people with a plague because of what they did with the calf Aaron had made. Now, the story isn't actually over. The crisis isn't over. It goes on for a few more chapters. And we just don't have time to read them all, but you can go home and read them. God moves out of the camp. Moses goes outside the camp and pitches a tent outside the camp, and the cloud goes and rests on the tent there, and the whole camp is watching Moses and God talk, and they're thinking, "Oh, what did we do?" And then they begin to collectively mourn, and they stand outside their tents, and they put on sackcloth and ashes, and they take off their ornaments, and they repent. And then Moses remakes the covenant, and they sign it. Moses' face is radiant. He tries to hide it. The tabernacle is built instead of a golden calf. And they got through this crisis. And the book of Exodus ends. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, wherever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they were sent out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it was lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and the fire was in the cloud by night, and the sight of all the Israelites during all their travels. So the book has a happy ending, but nobody's going to forget this incident. Surely they've learned their lesson. But then you read Numbers and Deuteronomy, and then you read Joshua and Judges. They don't learn the lesson. They're addicts. When God releases us from slavery, what do we do with our freedom? Will promises made when presented with the law keep us from the easy answers and the bad decisions? Usually not. Everyone who breaks the law usually knows they're breaking the law. Now, in this case, Moses, as a mediator, saves Israel. He turned down the tempting challenge to have God erase Israel and start over with him. He purges Israel of some of its rebels. Israel then submitted and repented, and God relented, and the story continued, and the tabernacle was built instead of a golden calf. But the cycle of promise, collapse, repentance, restoration would continue throughout the story of Israel. This pattern would continue all through the Old Testament. In fact, it's not broken. By the time we meet Jesus, well, they're not doing the golden calf thing anymore, but they're doing all kinds of other games. And that's how we are. Jesus, however, comes and becomes the final sacrifice. And so that sort of leaves us. Larry, like many of the people, eventually got hit by a car. And then I remember he was sleeping. This was before we had all of our fences up. He was sleeping in the bushes across the street. And I'd see him walking across Amherst out of the hospital with a walker. And it was like, oh, Larry. But beer he must have. And we sort of understand that. Now, we're not sleeping out on the grounds. We manage our addictions pretty well. Our calamities and our habits are less destructive than alcohol or drugs or other things, but we got them. They're in there. They might be subtle, these little patterns of behavior. I mean, there's a reason every week we have that little confession of sin part in our church, because whether we know what to confess or not, it's there. But if you followed my sermons throughout, you know that the pattern isn't misery, deliverance, law. Misery, deliverance, law. No, it's misery, deliverance, gratitude. Because here's the thing about law. As long as Carol was in the house with the addict, oh yeah, they'd mind. But more often than not, once they got out, and once the itching started, and once the temptations were there, it's really hard to say no. And by the grace of God, many people do obtain sobriety, but those things get transmitted into all sorts of other areas in our lives. And so then we have to ask the question, how can we change and not simply set up a police state? We're all reporting on each other, and I don't know, is it the pastor that's supposed to be the one that disciplines? And so, here we'll have a new rule. We talked about rules this morning in estuary. New rule, if anyone sins, tell the pastor, and he'll, I don't know what, beat you with a stick? Is that the way this is supposed to work? And even if we started that, you know what? It wouldn't make any of you any better. Because you'd just be good as long as somebody from church wasn't watching. But as soon as, hey, no living stoners around here, pastor ain't going to beat me with a stick. Israel needs a new heart. We need new hearts. The Spirit is given for our transformation. And the movement and direction of the Spirit, there are still consequences out there, and those can be helpful. The law is not a bad thing. But we finally need a new heart that says, yeah, cocaine is good, but Jesus is better. So I'm going to say no to cocaine and yes to Jesus. And Lord, give me your Spirit so that I can. The Spirit doesn't zap us. It's still a struggle. But like the thing I read last week out of Screw Tape Letters, he's not looking for cattle. Lewis picked that for a good reason. He's looking for servants who can become sons and daughters. And that's what we are. And so he leads us. And sometimes he disciplines us. And sometimes things fall through. And sometimes they're all far. And sometimes it isn't. But bit by bit by bit, we look at that cross. We sang that song already. It's the power of the cross. We look at that cross and we say, it's not the cross I fear. It's his love I delight in. Every parent knows this dance. When your kids are little, you say no. And there's a little consequence. Maybe they're sitting on a little timeout. Or maybe they don't get dessert or something and they fear mom and dad. But as they grow, they hopefully learn to love mom and dad. And mom and dad aren't keeping them in line by saying, if you disobey, I'm going to write you out of my will. Well, for most of us, that's a pretty empty threat because there's not going to be much anything